Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Artificial Intelligence in Philanthropy, Trends and Responsible Use, hosted by the Council on Foundations, the Technology Association of Grantmakers, and Project Evident. We're so glad that you're here today to learn about AI in philanthropy. We're glad to welcome people from all over the country, so go ahead and drop in the chat where you're joining us from today. Hi from Washington, D.C. We'll have the chat open today because there's a great variety of wisdom in the room, and we'd love to hear your perspectives and ideas. The chat is a place to learn from each other and share how this topic connects to your work. Before we get to the content of this call, I want to share a few tips about using the webinar technology. If you have questions for the panelists, use the Q&A tool in Zoom. We love to see your questions in the chat, but using the Q&A tool helps us organize the questions and inquiries that we want to return to later in the call. You can also upvote questions posed by others that you're interested in hearing us discuss later. We are recording the video, audio, and chat for this call. You'll receive access to the recording and all the links and resources that we share in the chat via email later this week. We'll also post the recording to our website. If you'd like to view auto-generated subtitles for the webinar, click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and then Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. If you need any support during the call, please send a direct message to me at Council on Foundations, or you can email webinars@cof.org. With that, I will turn it over to Wendy Torrance, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at the Council on Foundations, to introduce today's speakers. You can learn more about her and our speakers today by checking out links to their bios in the chat.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and welcome everyone. The Technology Association of Grantmakers provides our sector with important insights related to the strategic, innovative, and equitable use of technology. The Council is grateful to TAG for its leadership in advancing the sector. Today, TAG is joined by Project Evident, a nonprofit focused on supporting data and evidence-based decisions for social impact practitioners and funders. I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. Chantal Forster leads the Technology Association of Grantmakers as its executive director. For over 20 years, Chantal has worked across private, public, and social sectors to advance collaboration and impact. Appointed to her role in TAG in 2018, Chantal has become a voice for philanthropic investment in digital infrastructure and an advocate for centering our work on the grantee experience. Sarah DeTroya is a senior strategic advisor for product innovation at Project Evident. She brings experience at Health Leads and New Profit to her role at Project Evidence, where her experience as an investor, advisor, and leader help her integrate market insights with the internal change management necessary to realize new opportunities. They join us today to reflect on the challenges and opportunities that AI brings to the philanthropy sector and to share with all of you how AI and generative AI systems are transforming how we were all doing our work and achieving our missions. I invite you to offer a warm virtual welcome to Chantal and Sarah. Chantal, the floor is yours.
Wendy, thank you. I'm excited to go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen. All right, are you able to see my screen just fine? Great. So welcome, everyone. I'd like you to raise your hand if you've played this game, whether in a meeting or in a happy hour or a dinner party. The game goes like this. How long can we go before someone mentions AI? I think it's like 18 minutes, maybe 5 minutes if it's an internal tech team meeting. So we're all talking about it. We're all talking about AI right now. But the truth is, it's not new, actually. Case in point, I don't know if anyone's ever used Duolingo. Duolingo has 16 million active daily users, and Duolingo has been using AI for 10 years. You've used AI yourself in everything from Siri, Alexa, Google Translate. If you've seen autocomplete in your favorite email tool, that's AI. Google search, fraud detection by your bank, and hundreds, thousands of more applications. On a personal note, I remember my father working on a master's in AI in the late 80s. And then 20 years ago, I worked for a product dev team for a predictive analytics platform that's now part of the IBM Watson Studio. And we leveraged a wide variety of AI tools then. It's that old. So why are we all talking about it now? I think there are two reasons. One is that there have been some improvements to neural networks. They're one of the underlying forms of AI that power a lot of what I just described, right? Language translators, for example. So in 2017, Google, alongside researchers from University of Toronto, developed the transformer neural network. It's a new kind of neural network that essentially does this. It has the ability to sense the context in which a word is found. So in the past, you would feed like multiple words in sequence into an algorithm. It would spit back other words in sequence, but it didn't actually know the context of that word within the sentence or the paragraph. So transformer, I'm oversimplifying grossly, but the transformer neural network enabled that self-awareness or self-assessment of words within a sentence, language within its context. And then the second development was the just wider availability of big data. So it was easier for us and researchers to train these algorithms on larger and larger data sets that were now available. So those two things have really changed the dynamic. And so enter ChatGPT in late 2022. And that alone, that was version 3.5 of the large language model chatbot that we call ChatGPT. But it made a really big splash. It made a major splash because it seemed human, right? It seemed to understand what we were asking it. And it could generate not just sentences, but poetry and press releases and agenda and extract meaning. The marketing campaign was very well coordinated and very effective. And so now we're all talking about it. And as a result, there's a great deal of confusion about something that you've actually been using for quite a long time. So that's why TAG and Project Evident are here with you today with the council to just go a little bit deeper and chart a path forward for philanthropy. So a bit of an overview about what we'll be doing. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about a recent pulse check survey on AI that TAG conducted with our members. I'll share an example of an AI usage policy. I'll talk a little bit about an AI adoption framework that Sarah from Project Evident and I are collaborating on. And then I'll shift gears and Sarah will go much more deeply into a nuanced understanding of AI and some great case studies in the social sector about how people are leveraging these tools. So with that, I'll dive right into the survey. So we, last month, TAG decided to just level set with our members in philanthropy and ask them, what are you hearing? What are you being asked? And how can we help? Everyone's talking about how AI will change our lives and philanthropy is no different. So I want to share a little bit about what we're finding in that survey. So these are the two questions. You saw them on the previous slide. This is the first of the two questions we asked. And as you can see, most foundations right now are wrestling with four key questions. What are the risks? What are the ethical risks of AI? Mainly, they're talking about ethical risks. There are, of course, some other risks, but this is the one that most people are being asked at their organization. Number two, how can we use AI to streamline our grant-making processes and enable us to be more efficient and effective operationally? Number three, how can our nonprofit partners and grantees be enabled by AI how can AI make their lives more easy in grant applications and reporting, for example? And then the fourth bucket is actually my favorite bucket, which is how can we invest in AI to extend the mission of our nonprofit partners? How can they do more with the dollars through the use of AI? And then the second question we asked was, what do you need? What would be helpful for you right now? And so you can see that people would really like some basic education, some transparency on what is AI, what are these algorithms doing? They'd like guidance on how to navigate the ethical considerations to ensure that AI's usage improves inequity. They're also asking for practical information. They need some case studies on how to use AI responsibly. understand the practical applications of it. They'd also like more strategic conversation. We're going to get there in a minute, but they'd like place and space to have more strategic conversations about the role of AI in our sector and who should we partner with? How do we partner? What does it look like to invest on the longer horizon in AI? And then lastly, they'd really like a cookbook of assessing risk. So looking at a horizon of opportunities and understanding what the risks associated with each are, and determining how to proceed. Now, note that this survey was conducted before yesterday's somewhat historic bipartisan meeting on AI with Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Gates, Sam Altman, and others, led by a bipartisan group of senators. If it's helpful, I actually shared a recap on LinkedIn. I'll post that in chat. I shared a recap on LinkedIn of that meeting yesterday. It was pretty historic, and you'll see that the government is exploring its role very deeply in minimizing risk and maximizing benefit for our societies. So while the government wrestles with these, philanthropy is also really wrestling, and we're wrestling in this tactical reactive space, but we're also starting to, and I hope we'll go deeper in grappling with philanthropy's role in workforce education, minimizing future bias and harm, and then, investing in what Bill Gates called the transformational innovation with AI, the AI for good space. So yes, this may be new for philanthropy as much as it is for government, but Senator Schumer said yesterday that we have to try to act, as difficult as that may be. And so we're all doing our part. I invite you and your organizations to help address some of the needs that foundations are asking for related to AI. Here's some of what my small organization is doing. You can find the complete survey findings at this URL, some example AI usage policies, the solution showcase, a recording of an AI solution showcase we did last month, and then some plans for an AI adoption framework, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes sharing some of these examples of these resources. I'll delve into a couple of them. Many of your organizations are wrestling with AI usage within your orgs, by staff, by grantees. Some of you are creating full-blown usage policies. I'll share one in a minute. And then some are just naming concerns. And so as you see on this particular slide, this is a foundation that has not gone so far as to define usage, but they are simply codifying within their org an awareness of the concerns that exist around the use of AI. And so much of philanthropy is talking about bias. You might have seen the horror story. I'm sure you've seen the horror stories, but Bloomberg did a bit of research using the Stable Diffusion image generator, generative AI image generator, to create thousands of images related to job titles and crime. And the results are as bad as you might guess, with skin tone and gender being a very strong determinant of how a particular job gets displayed, portrayed, like doctor, lawyer, housekeeper, for example, highly gendered, highly skin toned results from that generative AI tool. And so Sarah from Project Evidence is going to go a little bit deeper on ethical issues. So we'll just simply post that study in chat if you're curious. So in addition to bias, privacy and ownership are also important. What happens, for example, to the privacy or intellectual property of content that's discussed during a meeting if there's an AI note taker that's in attendance? TAG has members who've restricted the use of AI note takers at all meetings for the organization. So there's a wide array of reactions. I'm sharing one that's very hands-off. I've just mentioned one that's very hands-on in restricting any AI note takers, for example, at their meetings. And then here's a third way. So this is a large foundation in TAG's membership that has created an AI usage policy for staff and board. And they've categorized the data that the foundation has into 3 buckets: public, non-sensitive, and then sensitive data. And they've essentially created a policy that governs the use of AI tools based on those 3 buckets of sensitivity. And so I will share an example of each. Public data, according to this foundation's policy, is anything that you could already see on the internet. And they are completely fine with staff, board, vendors using generative AI tools like ChatGPT with any of this text. So a staff member can paste any of this information in ChatGPT and ask for feedback, for example, or Bard, another generative AI tool. Non-sensitive data, it may not be publicly available, but it doesn't reveal any proprietary information or any confidential information about a grantee or a beneficiary or a staff member, for example. And so there are some guidelines related to what you can do with this bucket of information in AI and generative AI tools. This last bucket of sensitive data, this could be tricky. Probably you accidentally, before we started talking about all this, you might have pasted a grantee application into ChatGPT and said, hey, can you summarize this for me? Or you might have pasted, something else related, an NDA or a contract and ask it to highlight issues for you. This would be considered sensitive data that is restricted for use in these tools. If you go to OpenAI's website and explore how they store your data, they fully admit that there is an exposure risk, what they call an exposure risk to the data that you input into ChatGPT. The data stored by OpenAI on servers in the United States for 30 days. They also use the data that you input to analyze trends. They say they do not use that data to train their AI. But again, this bucket of very sensitive data is a risk not worth taking as the sector and the platforms continue to evolve, in my opinion. So shifting gears a little bit, we've shared on the previous few slides a couple of reactive steps that foundations can take right now. Things that you can use to address questions you're getting from your CEO. Maybe like, why aren't we using AI? Or are we already using AI? Or should we be using AI? Some of what we've previously shared might help you begin to address those questions. At the same time, it's important that we consider the long horizon. So TAG has recently announced a partnership with Project Evident to provide a more strategic lens on AI adoption. I think much in the same way that you heard at yesterday's Senate hearing, answering questions around long-term for our societies. How do we minimize risk and how do we invest to maximize benefit? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this AI adoption framework for the next minute or two so that you can understand what we're working on and maybe help us weigh in and refine this framework. So what you see here on the screen we'll be working on this concept over the next couple of months, but this is the loose concept. This is not a big framework. Please don't post this anywhere yet. We're still working on it. The horizontal swim lanes is a way of condensing all the factors into opportunities, risks, and then considerations for ethics and deployment. And those horizontal swim lanes then would be the considerations that you need to consider for each of the vertical elements. And the top of that framework shows individual use by staff, board, et cetera. In the middle, operational effectiveness. How can you use AI to become more efficient and effective in your operations? And then at the far right, how AI can be used to achieve the mission of philanthropy and the missions of our nonprofit partners. So we will be working on this over the next several months. We have two different committees, I should say, that are guiding the development of this framework, including stakeholders and researchers from throughout the sector. And so we've established the set of principles that you see here. In November, we'll be testing this framework, Sarah and I, at an in-person workshop at the TAG conference in Nashville this November. And so you'll see a version 1 working framework released publicly in December 2023. Again, we're just trying to equip the sector to assess opportunity, risk, ethics, deployment in a variety of spaces so that we can move forward without either overly embracing or overly shunning the use of AI in our sector. And so our hope is that the framework helps philanthropy make day-to-day decisions. Like, should we allow note takers, AI note takers, to attend our meetings, as well as more strategic ones, like how can we invest in AI to scale our operations so that the dollars we give go further? And then, my sincere hope is that we also use this opportunity to pause and ask, what is our responsibility in philanthropy? If we can rally to spin up $200 million in pooled funds for clean energy, or 500 million for local news innovation, what would it look like if we established a pooled fund for AI innovation grants for nonprofits, or deepened our investment in orgs like AI Now or the Partnership on AI? Inside Philanthropy had a recent article on the history of AI funding. It's not that we've never funded research and ethics before in this space. Orgs like McGovern, Schmidt Futures, MacArthur, Omidyar, and more have been doing that for quite a while. So we'll post that in the chat so you can see in that article a really great history of the work that's been done to date. So you are welcome to download all of these resources, track these issues at this webpage at the TAG website. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, one of the most thoughtful people I've encountered in TAG's work on AI in the past year. Sarah's a fellow traveler on the road of the third way, navigating between really irrational fear and unfounded exuberance regarding AI. And then also, a fellow believer in the promise of ethical AI to unlock potential and bridge the digital divide. So Sarah, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chantal. Okay, I'm going to move to my screen. So first of all, I really want to celebrate everybody who's joined, because we wrote a blog post for talking about philanthropic engagement with AI with the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And the first step was educate yourself about AI. And so I really appreciate folks who are here in the room educating themselves about AI and wanting to learn more. My introduction, Project Evidence, we exist because we believe data can be used not in a thumbs up, thumbs down capacity to understand whether or not we're achieving our missions, but it can really be used in an ongoing R&D capacity to improve and to get better results for communities. And we believe that's true for nonprofit practitioners as well as for foundations. You can imagine how excited we were as AI became more commonly understood and awareness was building in the nonprofit sector, and particularly how excited we were to be in partnership with TAG, because we really see this as a way forward for people to be able to use data in a way that is always on for learning inside of their organizations and improving equitable outcomes. So just a quick overview of AI and how it can be used. I want to share some case studies with you. That framework that Chantal was talking about, which was the individual use. Can I use ChatGPT as an individual in my work? All the way towards mission attainment, strategic use. I want to give you some examples of the mission attainment, because I think those are the examples that are most exciting for where our sector will be going in the next 5-10 years, if not sooner. So first, just to clean up sometimes some language confusion around AI. AI is the capability of a computer to mimic human cognitive function. This is problem solving. You probably have heard past performance is not a predictor of future behavior. Actually, that's how AI works. It is using past data to predict what might happen in the future. That is different than generative AI. So DALL-E, an image generator, ChatGPT, Bard, narrative generators. There are also sound and video generators. If you think about AI as, I love books about mushrooms, what are other people who like books about mushrooms? Can you recommend to me what that might look like for me? Because I'm part of this subgroup. Generative AI would be write me a new book about mushrooms that's focused on the mushrooms of South America, right? It's based on prior information and it's been trained on, but essentially, and it's still using prediction, but essentially it's generating something new and is creative, as opposed to analyzing past data to predict future outcomes. So I'm going to give you 4 examples of different organizations, one of whom is a funder, that is using a machine learning application within AI or generative AI to enhance their outcomes. So first, predictive analytics. Chantal, I loved your examples. Yes, we have, as a consumer in our society, you have not been engaged with as a one size fits most for more than a decade. You have been experiencing customized engagement. If a offline retailer, you have a credit card with them, they have data on you in terms of how you purchase and your habits. If you purchase with any online retailers, they have a bevy of information about you. And that means that data can be analyzed and you can be placed in a subgroup so that they can cater to your potential interests, needs, wants. So Target has a very famous case example of this. They obviously have hundreds of millions of data points across their shoppers and what they buy. They were interested in looking at women who were suddenly beginning to buy diapers and began to think about what did the purchasing habits look like 10 months before that? Could we actually predict if somebody was pregnant? And in fact, they could. They could see if you were buying a combination of, I think, 27 products, including Q-tips and unscented hand lotion, you were more likely to be buying diapers 9 months from now. And that was incredibly important to Target because they could begin offering you customized opportunities in terms of coupons or other ways they might want to engage with you so they could capture more of your wallet. That's a sort of a bold example of what's happening every day when you're shopping online. So an organization called Gemma Services, which works with about 100 young girls every year and provides long-term psychiatric care outside of their homes. They were interested in whether or not they could move towards something that looks more like Target. Were there subgroups that were not possible to see with like the naked eye for their counselors to be able to break the girls that they were working with into subgroups and provide a more customized experience with their program model? And in fact, by looking at historical data and using a version of predictive analytics called precision analytics, they were able to uncover new subgroups. So that meant the program that I would experience was different than the program that Chantal would experience, was different than the program that Wendy would experience. They still had a program model that had over a dozen elements, but the reality is some of those elements were more important to me and my likelihood of achieving success than they were to Chantal. So what happened in 2022 after implementing this model for a year? They had a 92% reduction. That's almost cutting in half the risk, which like the acuity score of girls who were exiting the program, which meant that they were less likely to show up in an emergency room and less likely to show up back in psychiatric care. It also created a almost 90-day reduction in length of stay. So young girls were back in their families almost 3 months in advance. So huge outcomes, not by changing their program model, but by tailoring it and customizing. I think one of the things we really lose when we do a one-size-fits-most programmatic model is that we lose being able to tailor to the ends of the bell curve. And often those folks at the end of the bell curve are the folks who are most in need of support. Interestingly, Gemma has taken their algorithm. They're now looking to sell it to other organizations that have similar program models so they don't have to build their own algorithms. That will actually become a new revenue source for Gemma. Another machine learning algorithm would be natural language processing. You're really familiar with this, as Chantal was saying. Hey, Google, hey, Siri, hey, Alexa. Those are all ways in which we might engage with natural language processing. So there is a funder, a very large funder that sits on thousands of grantee reports. And they were frustrated that the information that's in those grantee reports is essentially locked into PDFs, and that knowledge wasn't available to their program officers to inform their work with current grantees or make decisions about future grantees. So they end up using an algorithm with natural language processing to read and access all of those documents. So what happened is that staff could quickly query historical grantee reports to inform their decision making. What do we know about hunger and early childhood development? What do we know about post-secondary supports for Black men aged 24 to 30? So in a way, being able to tap into the knowledge that the foundation really already had, it just wasn't accessible to the folks who needed it. They're also looking at a potential opportunity with what would it mean if they opened the ability to query their database to their practitioners. Oops, that's my theory going off on me. So when we think about the what works clearinghouses that are static and maybe have not delivered the type of insights and the type of impact I think we were all hoping when they were developed, the reality is each foundation within their grantee reports is sitting on their own What's Works clearinghouse. They're sitting on an extraordinary amount of information that could really help enhance equitable outcomes. This is a way that possibly you could make that available to those in your community. And finally, it was going to help program officers really ensure that new grants that they were making weren't reinventing the wheel, right? So we have program officer turnover, things change over a number of years. Sometimes an idea sounds really exciting, but it isn't in fact new. But there may be a way that the idea can be evolved into something that's building on prior work. So that's the power of natural language processing. Recommendation engines, something that we are all experiencing and using. My Netflix homepage looks entirely different from Chantel's, entirely different from yours. Netflix has over 2,000 individual case profiles for movies on which they build recommendation pages. And on top of that is then learning based on your own actions. That's how you get recommendations. I was quite surprised when Korean language TV started showing up in my recommendations. Boy, they were watching closely. They knew me. So equal opportunity schools, they look to help school districts find students that should be enrolled in AP or IB classes, but are being overlooked for some reason. And they actually look at a pretty tremendous amount of data. They collect their own data through surveying of students and teachers. They marry that to standard data that the schools are already collecting, from disciplinary actions to attendance to grades. They also then look at data from outside the school that's available from census tract data about the community in which the catchment in which schools are pulling. And then an individual is assigned to that school to help identify these folks. And Equal Opportunity School said, like, could we build something to look at all of this information to make recommendations to our staff members about who's being overlooked, not being the determinant of who's being overlooked, but make a recommendation to our staff so there's still a human in the loop. Now, this is something they're still in the midst of planning, but the goal is that would allow them to potentially reconcile this concern. They're an organization that uses a lot of data, but there's a little bit of a wrestle inside their organization between a value conflict of being data-driven and oriented to equity. And they really saw this as a project that could marry those two things and help their organization move forward. They believed it will also increase the accuracy and efficiency of the student identification process. And when they gain efficiencies there, that meant that the individual who is spending a significant amount of time finding the students has more time to support the students when they're in the AB and IB classes, AP and IB classes. So shifting my workday so it's at a more impactful place than something that can be aided by the use of a recommendation engine. And ultimately, this is going to enable them to scale the program while preserving impact. I want to give you one more example because none of those are about generative AI, and that's where all the hype cycle is sort of right now on generative AI. generative AI, based on large language models, that's for a language AI like ChatGPT. So you might be aware that ChatGPT version 3 was trained on all the information that was on the internet up to 2021. So that's the data set it used to be trained on. Crisis text line, which is a triage service for people who are in crisis using text versus using phone lines. They actually use AI in a couple of different ways, but the way they're using generative AI is around training volunteers. The problem they were trying to solve is they train about 10,000 volunteers a year. That's a significant amount. They all go through a 30-hour training program. But part of what they were learning is that once they went through the training program, not everybody felt comfortable going immediately onto the platform and serving folks that were higher risk. I may be comfortable chatting with somebody who's had a breakup, but I'm not comfortable chatting with somebody who might want to engage in self-harm. So they used their past experience, the text conversations with past clients. They then wrote fictional scripts. So they didn't upload real client data. They uploaded fictional scripts around low risk and high risk scenarios and created a chatbot that was entirely about training. So it's a crisis text line boundaried training bot. It is not available on ChatGPT. It's based on fictional scripts, but it lets a volunteer engage with that chatbot as if they're in a real texting conversation of somebody who's at low risk or at high risk, thereby increasing my confidence, increasing my skills, and making me perform better while I'm live on the platform. So again, more effectively training close to 10,000 volunteers, building that volunteer confidence, and they hope reducing churn of folks who go through the training and then say, I'm not comfortable, right? How do I build that comfort? So I hope that's exciting to you. I mean, these are the types of examples that kind of light Chantal and I up in terms of folks really using AI to go towards mission attainment beyond just efficiencies. But of course, yeah, the thing that is incredibly important is thinking about AI and bias. I think this is, when you look at the tools and how the technology was built, it's not that people didn't care about ethics, but the commercial sector is compensated for caring about scale and profitability. And so that's kind of the core criterion that was used for developing these tools. So first, I just want to remind people that all data and all models have bias associated with them because they're involved. Humans are involved. It's not just AI models. So I love that we have the emphasis now and really looking at where is bias possibly happening in our organization and around AI. I would just say open the aperture, widen the lens, because it's around all data and all models. When you think about AI, bias can really be introduced at two levels. So one is the data set that you're using to train a model. So Chantal's wonderful example from Bloomberg around whose image comes up when we talk about certain jobs. That's because the data set it was trained on, which might have been the internet, has its own biases around what are the pictures and what are the skin tones of people that we're showing you in those jobs. So if you want to make sure that you're hiring more women in your workforce and you want to find women who are likely to be successful, so you want to create an algorithm to go through your resumes, and yet the preponderance of folks in your organization are male, and you use your male training data to try and find women applicants, you're going to find your women applicants are actually getting weeded out, right? Because you're using a data set that's not fully encompassing of the breadth of humanity. The second way you'll see bias is it's actually hard-coded into the system. So it's not the data set that was trained, it's the values that we weighted in the system. So an interesting case from Women's World Banking is they were looking at microlending and why microlending was going to more men versus women, even though women had equal credit risk. And they had realized that the algorithm that had been written underweighted work that was done in the home or in the retail sector versus work that was done outside the home and in other commercial sectors. Well, there's a pretty big gender split in terms of where you might find women gaining their work experience. So while it wasn't intentional, it was hard-coded into that algorithm that women, even though they had equal credit scores, were going to be deemed a higher risk for microlending. So that's a way that you could actually see an algorithm coded with bias. And it wasn't that the algorithm said, we don't want to lend to women. There was something else that was correlated to women that was allocated, that was coded into it. So I think the challenge beyond just data and models for AI is the fact that models are highly scalable when we get into things that are technology backed. If you have an individual in your organization who's not values aligned, that could be a challenge. But if you have an AI chatbot, virtual assistant that is interacting with your community and it's not values aligned, the potential for that damage is just much greater because of the scale. Also with machine learning, which is a number of these applications I've been discussing, they're not stagnant. Each new piece of data that comes through them, they get smarter and they get smarter and they get smarter. And if you're not careful about the data that is being fed to those algorithms, they will learn biases without any explicit direction from you. So I'm just going to look. We still have a little bit of time. So I want to talk just a bit about the tools that you might find available to you. And I want to talk a little bit about the cost and test, and sort of ability to test and transparency trade-off. Chantal, do you want to jump in?
Sarah, we will have time, but you do have a question related to the example of the funder using NLP. Go through the grants report. So let's allocate a little bit of time for that one.
Great. Let me look in the Q&A and see what that question is.
Yeah, I'm happy to just share. They're just wondering if there's a case study and what the funder was looking for in their grants database, essentially. If there were any, lessons learned. Was there any public share out?
There's a reason why it's called Funder X. There is no public share out. So unfortunately, we're at the beginning of folks who are doing this. So what was interesting for that funder is they hired a third-party evaluation firm to go through and to call what were the learnings from a set of grants. And they basically wanted to look at what was the cost and time investment, having a third party do that, and how much of that could be done with an algorithm. And what they learned is it could absolutely be done. And that while the initial setup was somewhat similar in terms of the cost of paying a third party to go through it once they had the algorithm, it was going to be an always on opportunity for them. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any additional investment that needs to be made once you bring an algorithm into your organization, because they can drift. So you do have to continue to tune them. But essentially they realized that this was going to be a way to bring this type of knowledge into their organization in a much more efficient manner.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll track the other questions. We can answer them after you're done.
Sounds good. So I think one of the, when we've talked to nonprofits, and I think this shows up for foundations as well, some of the real concerns about accessing AI tools and knowledge is cost and is talent. And one of the things the for-profit sector is quite good at is figuring out, how do I pull things into less expensive, less complicated tools to use? And you are seeing that with Amazon Web Services, Salesforce, others creating tool packages where you don't have to have data scientists on staff. You don't have to have coders on staff, and you can access a tool and upload your data into that tool and keep it as sort of a private boundaried instance for your organization. So there's a challenge with those tools. It brings down the cost and it brings down the talent requirements. But those private no-code tools cannot be tested for user bias because they are intellectual property of Amazon or Salesforce or Microsoft. So understanding how those tools were created, how they were tested for bias, the data that was used in order to train those algorithms, that is the type of kind of buyer beware and vendor screening that our sector needs to bring in to buying these tools. We have tremendous purchasing power. We have over $400 billion of purchasing power in our sector. That purchasing power is largely on the sideline right now. And without our purchasing power there, the tools that are being developed, people aren't asking those questions, or they're not asking those questions with the same level of acuteness and urgency that our sector asks those questions. So really important to do that. The challenge for large language models and things like ChatGPT are free, is that they have become so complicated, you really can't test them for bias. So when you talk to data scientists around OpenAI, the answer is like, we don't actually understand how this is working anymore. It is the work of the large language models are so complex. So again, that brings in a challenge around bias. And if you think about the fact that ChatGPT was trained on everything that's on the internet up until 2021, think about what's on the internet. Think about what that represents, the best and I would say the worst of our societies. Think about how much of that information is about the global north versus the global south. So, the biases in the data that have been trained, very, very hard to think about how you go after that in a large language model. I think the good news about open source or private custom tools is that they're transparent. They can be tested. The bad news about private custom tools is that they are more costly. And the challenge with open source is that you do have to have some expertise on your staff to be able to modify those open tools and be able to use them with your data. But when you hear that term black box, that's what people are talking about with private no-code tools. No code means you don't have to know code to use them, or large language models. It is, you cannot test them for bias, and that's a real challenge in terms of our accessing those tools. I'm going to stop my share there.
Sarah, I would love to, there's a couple of questions that, we can get to in depth, but I'd love to open up a conversation with you around the power inherent in the ability to adopt these tools. So one of the questions is about using AI for fundraising. There's another question in the Q&A about, should we enable grantees to use AI to write an application? And I think something you and I have talked about is left alone, the orgs that will adopt AI are already the orgs with power and money.
That's right.
And so the smaller nonprofits, the less equipped nonprofits, those who actually could desperately use AI to write a grant because they don't have a grant writer on staff, those are the people that will be left behind in their ability to adopt. And so I've wrestled with, what is philanthropy's responsibility to enable nonprofits to adopt AI so that they don't fall further behind on the smaller community-based end of the scale. And I think about that in both of those questions we see in Q&A, the ability to write shortcut a grant application or a report, the ability to use AI for fundraising. I don't know if you have thoughts there as well.
Well, so first of all, I'm an entirely, as you know, Chantal, since we've had this conversation, in agreement. And I think we only have to look to the past of how the internet was adopted originally to nonprofits, or how CRMs, customer relationship management systems, were adopted in the world of nonprofits. And you just see it's what you would consider elite organizations that have access to that technology first. And then the use cases for that technology get defined by those organizations. And you are an elite organization if you have relationships with top 100 funders, or you have relationships with pro bono relationships with large top 500 corporations. And then the suite of those products again get developed for the largest and the most technologically sophisticated of the nonprofits, as opposed to the community-based ones. So I think we can look to the past. We have a pretty bad history of that's the way technology cascades into, or change writ large kind of cascades into the sector. I look at the opportunity with AI in some ways similar to the calamity of COVID, where there was a huge shift that required funders to think differently and to think comprehensively, not just about the largest organizations, but also about the community organizations. And I'm really aching for funders to step forward in a coalition that is thinking broadly about the infrastructure that is required for AI to be adopted broadly by the nonprofit sector. the last thing I'd like to leave on that topic is the irony of, we have concerns about nonprofits using Grantable or ChatGPT to write a grant. We also have grant management software that is excited about using AI to read grants, to help grant makers make sense of the flow of grants that they're getting. In a world in which we have AI on one side to help write the grant, and on the other side to help read and process the grant, I think the question is, maybe we should change the grant. Maybe this isn't a technology problem. Maybe this is a human problem.
Sarah, I could not agree more. And it's interesting, in my role as ED of TAG, I often have product providers in our space ask me to provide a sounding board for ideas that they have. And early in the AI hype cycle, we had a product provider come to me and say, hey, we'd really want to implement ChatGPT for grant makers. And the first case study was, because of course the purchases of their software are the foundation. So the first case study was, the first usage was reading the grant, simplifying the reading, the processing of the grant applications. And one of the things I urged them to do was not go to market with just something to benefit the funders, to go to market with something that also benefits the nonprofits. And so when you look at this particular platform, they have ChatGPT enabled, or OpenAI enabled on both sides of the equation. So a nonprofit can use OpenAI to generate an application based on a set of inputs, and then the funder can also use it to process on the other side. But it begs the question of, what's the point of the application altogether? Now, the flip side is, if you leverage AI then to match make, as it were, you go back to the bias problem.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you spoke a little bit about AI fundraising tools. You know, I would love to throw a wild card question out there. We haven't spoken about this, but in yesterday's Senate hearing, you heard in the debrief, senators talking about whether whether releasing these AI tools open source was a good thing or a bad thing. Right? It increases transparency, but at the same time, then these very powerful tools are in the hands of what we might call bad actors, as an oversimplification. I have mixed feelings about this. You know, I haven't really landed in my own position on whether open source release of AI is net good or bad. I think there's a great deal of governance and regulation that needs to be put in place, but ultimately, I usually fall on the side of transparency. I don't know if you have any emerging thoughts.
This is such a great question, and certainly merits much deeper thinking on my part, and I look forward to this conversation with you and with others, Chantal. So I think there are two things that I have been thinking a lot about. One is human in the loop. You know, what does it mean to insist that there's always a human in the loop when an algorithm is concerned? And I just feel like increasingly, without having a human in the loop, we are really, we're really putting ourselves at risk. The other piece is the transparency versus IP. And I think I'm still landing on the place of transparency, because in the absence of transparency, I don't think the good actors will have tools that they'll be able to be confident in, and that people will be able to have trust across the board in the tools. This is a tremendous technology, but it has the possibility of completely eroding trust in our population. I think a lot about social media, you know, and what has been the curve on social media, from fun to pretty destructive to a lot of burnt bridges in terms of who wants to be a part of social media any longer, and how people are using those tools. I would hate to see AI ride a similar curve because of it engendering a complete lack of trust in populations. So I think transparency is going to be one of the only ways that we can really ensure that algorithms are not racist, that the data is inclusive, and potentially equip a much broader set of people to use good algorithms. But that's where I am today, but I'd say check back.
the cautionary note about the metaphor around social media, right, gives a rise to one of my concerns, the privatization of a public sphere in the online public discourse, right? And so in what sense do we want another element of technological advancement of our society to be totally privatized? So our friends at the council, we've gone way off into a session 2.0, but I don't see any other outstanding questions. I'm checking chat. I'm checking effective training available on how to use AI for grant writing. That's a question from Cheryl. You know, Candid actually has a really interesting session on using AI for fundraising. I did post a tool, fundwriter.ai, Cheryl, to answer your question about grant writing. And then I'm seeing if there's anything else here. I think we're all caught up. So with that, Sarah,
I'm going to plug. I'm going to plug something. So those case studies that I had the pleasure of sharing with you, we had to find those by, kind of sorting through the sector and trying to figure out what was going on. There is currently an active survey that we'll link in the chat with Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and Project Evident, where we're querying funders and nonprofits about their AI use. And it's both about, even if they're not using it, we'd like to understand that as well. We're hoping that we will get a robust response to this survey so we can come back to you and say, these are how foundations are thinking about AI technology. This is how they're thinking about funding it, whether it's within existing program areas or actually its own technology area. This is what's happening inside of nonprofits. This is what different roles inside of a nonprofit, how they're using AI or not using AI, and what are the gaps or barriers that they have around AI use. So this would be a tremendous asset, I think, for all of us in the sector, just to get our arms around what's going on. So I really invite you to take the survey, invite your colleagues to take it, send it to your portfolios, because we do want to have folks from across organizations represented. We don't just want one individual from an organization or a foundation. We'd love to have a broad number of people really filling that out. So I hope you'll join us in learning.
Thank you very much, Chantal and Sarah, for joining us today. We are eager to have feedback from those attending about what other questions you might have as we continue to join the conversation about AI in the sector. And with that, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.